1, 2, 3.
Добрий день.
Hello, I welcome all of the presentees. I am Olga Tamanova, and the Media Center of Ukraine is going on with its work. Today we will be speaking about the results of the NATO summit 28th till the 30th of June. The attention of the whole world was directed onto this event. We have seen lots of official statements, and now we will be speaking what those statements were about. I'd like to begin with the introduction of our experts. Today we have Oleksiy Pavliuchyk, security planning expert at Center for Defense Strategies, Khara, foreign affairs and security policy expert at Center for Defense Strategies, diplomat, advisor to the defense minister of Ukraine in 2020. We have Oleksiy Melnik, co-director, foreign relations programs, coordinator of international projects of Razumkov Center, military expert. And we have today Vadym Denysenko, Executive Director of the Ukrainian Institute for the Future. I welcome you here, dear colleagues, so I'd like each of you to spend several minutes to provide your assessment, first of all, because we can see that the strategy of NATO has changed. Now we can see that in comparison with 2010, when Russia was defined as a strategic partner, the main change which took place, now NATO defines Russia the most serious, the most dangerous threat. So what are your comments? Please, several minutes each. Oleksiy. Hello, everybody. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation to this event. Yes, really, what took place this week is a historical event, and for Ukraine it has really very substantial meaning, because in fact all of the points which we were speaking about for 8 years, they are now registered and documented. Whatever concerns the Russian Federation, the status of the state which is waging war for in fact at least the 9th year already. And this document gives the reasons for all of the strategists, for all of the NATO member countries and partners to lead and to make all of their strategic planning documents proper, according to the taken decisions. First of all, of course, I would like to see as soon as possible for all of the states, NATO member states, to introduce certain changes towards their strategies of national security, where they would precisely mention who is who. And for that, you just need to read the document which was signed. That is the concept of strategic concept of NATO, which is in fact the document of strategic planning. And it reflects the courses and trends which in fact will move the development and adaptation of NATO during the next 10 years. So all of the changes which can be found in the document, and they are rather numerous, they are very important. Even if it's just one sentence, it changes the conceptual provisions. So we may say the same about the use of the forces of the alliance, and also how this support and help will be given to such states as Ukraine in our fight against aggressor, and also the policy of open doors, which is so important for NATO and Ukraine, because it shows that the principles and values which used to be and which are still in NATO, they are there, and they are being supported by the statements which we heard during those 3 days at NATO summit. Thank you. Alexander? Thank you. Well, in fact, I'd like to say in the broader sphere, there was the G7 group before. Some of the important decisions were taken. So, in fact, there was the decision about the candidate to the accession and to the members of the EU given to Ukraine. Considering the NATO summit, in spite of the continuation of the war with Russia, and we don't know how long it will be, and we have huge losses from our side, because every life is very important for us, but still we can already say that, in fact, Russia and its regime has lost strategically. NATO has the aim, and it's not only a Russian Federation. We can also say, speak about the drawbacks of this summit. I've got some points to mention, so we can mention them in the Q&A session. But Ukraine is lost for Russia forever. There is the perspective of Ukraine to become the EU member. There is still the perspective, which depends on us mostly, of membership in NATO. Russia has lost, in fact, Arctic region. The Baltic Sea is in fact becoming the NATO lake, and in fact the presence has changed, I mean of the countries of the eastern flank, at the eastern flank has changed, and the Russians will have to respond with their scarce resources, which will have to be used anywhere. And the positive is also that NATO is becoming more weightful. It will be playing even more important role with the transatlantic region, I mean China. Unfortunately, the role of China is a bit vague. It was shown, some of the negative influences and impacts were shown, but we heard it, and it's important because the most important adversary for us is Russia. This is the dangerous country for us, but we shouldn't also diminish the impact of China, in particular for Ukraine. So it's good that it has been reflected there as well. So in fact, this summit was about the NATO members, but there were many participants who have directly or indirectly impacted Ukraine and our security in the strategic perspective. And now, because it was announced that about the support for us. So of course it's a positive point, but there is also some space for perfection, I guess. Some room for perfection. Okay, thank you. Hello. I would like to agree with what was already mentioned by our colleagues about what has happened. One more important point is that traditionally, before the development of this document, there is a very lengthy process which involves a wider circle of people, and the Ukrainian experts also had an opportunity to provide their offers. The responsible people for the preparation of the concept of NATO were coming here, and it was pleasant for me to see some of the points. Of course, I do not claim that those are points of Ukrainian authorship, but still it is really resonating with the points which were made by the Ukrainian non-governmental experts. The second point, which as for me is really worth mentioning, as it was mentioned by Oleksiy, now this is a political document, it's of a very high quality, it's interesting and so on. It's important how this document will be implemented in the practical defense documents, how it will be reflected in the national documents. And maybe the last point is not just the summit itself and the concept, strategic concept, but I would like to speak about the discussion which is taking place now about the countries which are now in the gray zone of security. So it is so important to have this declaration about the policy of open doors. Simultaneously, this is the window of opportunities which is still not open. But we need to follow that, and it was mentioned for more than once. We need not to miss this chance. As far as I know, I'm communicating with Petro Kananoev, who is one of the practical experts in the cooperation of Ukraine with NATO. We were advising whether the preparation plan of actions will be used about the new countries, Sweden and Finland, because in my opinion those countries, if not for 100 but for 99%, they are ready already. So definitely this is the goal which Ukraine has to follow in spite of the existing priorities. When we have such an opportunity, not to waste time and not to lose such an opportunity for some maybe formal points. For Ukraine at the moment, when this opportunity emerges, to be fully ready without any of the political prolongings to gain the membership. So in fact we do a lot about that in the practical way. Thank you. Well, in fact about the document itself, I cannot add anything more. The only thing I'd like to say is that, and I'd like to drive your attention to the fact that maybe now we can speak about the irreversible change of the rhetoric of the NATO member countries, in particular of the G7 countries. In this case, just a month ago even, it would be hard to imagine for them unanimously to speak that the Russia is an enemy, the adversary, and the understanding that Russia is an enemy came irreversibly into the whole policy of the collective West. This is an advantage for us because it opens for us the opportunities on the further cooperation in the military sphere with these countries, and still it will allow the leaders of lots of countries not to be in doubts and not to provide any of unnecessary conditions. It will speed up the time to solve important points for us. So if we speak in the political sphere or in the surface of political psychology, in fact, there was the huge and I think irreversible change in the consciousness of the majority of the politicians of the West. Everybody heard the declaration of the US President Biden that since now there has been a decision to increase the NATO presence in Europe, in the air, in the sea, on the land. So what is this statement about, and which countries will it concern? What will it mean for Ukraine? If anybody of you is willing to answer, please. Oleksiy? Yes, the declaration of President Biden concerns first and foremost the eastern flank of Europe, the countries which are already taking part in the operations on deterrence of the aggressor. So in fact, now the alliance is already on the stage, what we say, the deterrence. It has begun. So this is the increase to the brigade level of the battalion groups which are now located in the east. It is totally reasonable. The increase of the troops to the 300,000 is the approximate indicator which will provide to deter the possible aggression of the enemy if Russian Federation decides to do that. So we may say that the alliance is still in the stage of deterrence, not in the stage of defense. So whatever is written in the strategic documents before and the strategic concept witness about the multidimensional type of war which is taking place, the hybrid type of threats. So it's reasonable to increase all of the capacities the alliance has, not only the land component but all of the dimensions, both the cyber threats and the space threats, to be covered as well. Because Russia, as we know, does not end in Europe. It is in fact having presence in half of the world. So this deterrence will take place mostly not only in Europe, but in the cities where Russia can show itself as an aggressor. Maybe somebody wants to add anything? Well, I just wanted to add a very short, a bit of a salt, because though Russia is defined as a direct threat and we have some positive changes to deter and, God forbid, protect the alliance, what wasn't done out of the important points, the update, the suspension, or maybe even cancellation of the principal act of Russia-NATO, because Russia has violated everything. And what is written there is stopping the people. We can see that the rotational presence is increasing in Romania and the permanent presence is strengthening in Poland, but those are not combat units. This is the HQ, the headquarters mostly. Why is this decision taken? Because NATO is restricting itself with the rules which they agreed with Russia, in spite of Russia violating whatever is possible. I do understand that in this act the very important point are the rules or the principle of 3 no's as for the nuclear weapons. There are no plans, no sense, and no development of the nuclear weapons at the eastern flank. This was the goodwill gesture, not to show the aggressive role of NATO, that NATO is the stabilizing factor, but taking into consideration the latest statements of Putin that that Iskandars are capable to have a nuclear charge and it should be located on the territory of Belarus, changes everything. The decision of to use Sarmats in spite of the economic crisis is still hazardous, so NATO should respond. It seems to me it should be right to respond, or at least to suspend the point about the permanent dislocation of on the territory of the eastern flank, or just to cancel these provisions. Of course, the positive is that the higher presence and involvement of the United States. We do understand that the NATO is relying upon the power of this state, and I like that the concept mentioned that the nuclear weapons, until the nuclear weapons is there, it will be one of the deterring factor for the alliance. It's incredibly important. And about 2 or 3 months ago, Germany adopted the nice decision to have still nuclear sharing. So they took the decision to modernize the aircrafts which are capable to bear American nuclear bombs. So it seems to me it's incredibly important as a stabilizing factor, first of all for the Baltic countries and Poland, but altogether it deters Russia. This is a kind of the balance, nuclear balance. But I said that some of the positions had to be updated and reconsidered. Thank you. As I already mentioned in my introduction speech, this political document, in fact, each phrase has to be deciphered. The document is only a bit more than 10 pages, but still, if we implement all of that, it could be thousands of pages. But if we count that in money or time, it could mean years and billions. Just 2 points about the practical use. What will be done as for the strengthening of the eastern flank? We are speaking about not only about the strengthening of the contingent and the staff which is there rotating or more or less permanently, the defense means, but also the creation of the infrastructure, the creation of the reserves of ammunition and also material technical means. And all of that is in the context of the current events. When we speak why NATO partners cannot deliver the weapons and ammunition in the necessary amount and as quick as we need it, then there are some objective reasons for that. Because almost previous 3 decades of peaceful time and partnership with Russia, or the lack of challenges from China, led to substantial weakening of these key functions which NATO has to bear as a defense alliance. That is why this process will be intensely restored. All of this infrastructure and reserves will come closer to the border of Ukraine, which in case of necessity can also be used to support Ukraine as a partner. Well, just in a nutshell, we just need one political aspect, which is, during the last 22 years, Putin had just one system of negotiations, that is, increasing the stakes. He always held negotiations increasing the stakes. And besides 2 cases, the aircraft shot down by Erdogan and the Wagner in Syria, he always increased the stakes, and this is how he solved his issues. So this summit bears a very important significance, political significance, because it is also the part, it is the first time when during the last 2 decades, the collective West says, no, we do not follow your increase of stakes. And this is the psychological blow against Putin. who is very sensitive towards such points. He perceives it as the personal offense and his own humiliation. We are dealing with a country where lots of things depend on the psychological state of one person. Accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO, what will it change for Europe and what will be the response from Russia? I love this topic, in fact. So, in fact, it's a huge strategic loss of Putin. In fact, in Europe. The first and the most important point, why Finland decided to join NATO, not just because they feel themselves that they feel vulnerable and Putin will attack Finland. No, they are rather capable, one of the most capable nations which borders with Russia. I liked the words of the president. He said that during those decades, the opportunity to become the NATO member at any moment was the part of our strategic calculations. And when Putin said that he has the right to refuse the right of the other free nations, it has become the last drop which changed their opinion. This is a very important point, and that is why I like how the president of the US says that Putin wanted to Finlandize NATO, but in fact NATO has been Finlandized. And I totally agree with Oleksiy that we need to do whatever is possible to become, in fact, compatible when the window of opportunity opens, as well as Ukraine opened this window for Finland. If there were no this war, they would think. And the most important thing, that Putin cannot do anything, but it's another story. So Finland is really a very combat-capable country. I really like that soon, when the additional capacities will work, 64 F-35s on the north is a serious force. And I'm not only speaking about the 1,340 kilometers of the border of Finland and Russia, but the capacity of NATO to protect the Baltic states. First of all, Estonia and Lithuania. You remember the research of reincorporation of 2016. They said that 47-1 that the Russian troops will be in the capitals of these two countries. And that 2 weeks ago there was the article in the Financial Times when the Prime Minister of Estonia was dissatisfied that the older plans foresaw 180 hours for NATO to repulse Russia from them. And looking at Ukraine, which losses we see and ruinings, Estonia just would stop existing, would cease existing, because it's a small country with a low level of population. So, of course, NATO has updated its plans. I like it, and it's so important. But if we look at the north, I already mentioned Arctics. Russia is trying to militarize the Arctic. It's a very important region for the whole world, not only for the Nordic countries, for Canada and for the US. Russia wants to control the northern maritime route. They consider it to be a big resource for the development, and of course Koilsky Peninsula and Murmansk, where the Russian fleet is, including the submarines with ballistic missiles. This will also be the accession of NATO infrastructure to Russia. The Baltic Sea is becoming the NATO lake, it's obvious, and an important role is of Sweden with their Gotland island, which in fact is the bone in the throat for Russia. They will definitely it will be necessary to do something for them. They will have to strengthen themselves. Indirectly, it will play a positive role, because after the annexation of the Crimea, Russia has invested huge resources to militarize the Crimea and to restore the Black Sea fleet, because Ukraine was a deterring factor. We stopped the opportunity for the Russians to modernize the Black Sea fleet, so it was the smaller threat for the countries. So if not the annexation of Crimea, we wouldn't have the Syrian campaign. The Russia wouldn't come back to the north of Africa and, in fact, the Middle East. So now they will have to do something to change the situation. I think it's totally positive. And also, in connection with that, the positive is that the relations with the US and Turkey are better now. Yes, it was not that beautiful that the Turkey had those requirements, but finally the modernization of F-16 for the Turkish has been ordered, and the sales of 16 F-35s in those relations have improved between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. So it's incredibly positive for us. We really would like Turkey to go on being a reliable partner of NATO, and then of course they won't have that room for maneuvering and to listen to Putin. It doesn't mean that Erdogan will totally change his position, of course, but definitely he won't be closer to Russia in comparison with what he used to be. Could I add a couple of words? Yes, because I really like the change of the word Finlandization. That's just wonderful. Secondly, the very popular phrase which is discussed in the social media about the goodwill gesture. The response of Russia will be also the goodwill gesture. What is this goodwill gesture? Many people already mentioned that Russia is capable for goodwill gestures when it is forced to, and really convincingly. So if you follow the chronology of the response of Russian officials for the possible steps of Finland or Sweden about NATO, this rhetoric has changed. And now when Putin seems personally said that it's not that scary and it's not like Ukraine, he again showed the goodwill gesture in front of the obvious fact that he is forceless. And also his statement that the European Union and the accession of Ukraine to the EU is not bad, but just remember what was in 2013, when he understood that we have the status of a candidate and he can't do anything with that, then he has to show this goodwill gesture. And the last point I'd like to say, what are the motives of Finland and Sweden of accession to NATO? Yes, those are guarantees of security, but those security guarantees is the separate issue which we can discuss. Mostly and firstly, those are prejudices. Because prevention of aggression, not prejudice, of course, because on the meeting of Euro-Atlantic aggression in Ukraine, the citizens had a very low level of awareness. But still, this is the totally sane to pose the question whether the aggression in Donbass and annexation of Crimea happened if Ukraine could be the member of NATO. Some percentage of the people who answered yes was about 30 or 40%, in spite of the support or not support of NATO. So first of all, we need to prevent the aggression. Thank you, dear colleagues. Your questions, please use the mic. Hello, Channel 24. I wanted to ask you what were the drawbacks of the summit? Alexander, could you begin? Yes, in fact, the most important was about this act of principles. I think that it could be updated, reconsidered, and at least some of the provisions about dislocation could be suspended. It seems to me it's rather important, because on the one hand, there is the understanding that Russia is a threat. On the other hand, I like that the leaders of the Baltic countries and Poland were happy that this strengthening will take place. But whether it is really broadcast into the equipment and people located there, and what are the further military plans? This is rather interesting. We will see that in the future. But if we are speaking about the Baltic region, it is now really strengthened powerfully. But if we speak the Black Sea region, it did not happen. I mean, the rotational presence in Romania, there are 2 additional destroyers in Italy, but undoubtedly with the opportunity to work on the Black Sea. As for the permanent presence or the permanent group in the Black Sea, it did not emerge. Of course, we would like to see the strengthening of the Black Sea. That is about the drawbacks. Out of the negative points about China, we need to speak about that as well, though we seem to be far. It seems to me that undoubtedly this was the hand of France and Germany, that they were trying to avoid, to escape. They said that China is just a threat as a competitor. or something like that. So in fact, Germany and France still have the same mistaken approach as they used to do against Russia. Let us not irritate China, let us consider it an opportunity. I don't say that China is a threat, but we should show what's their negative influence onto the Euro-Atlantic security. It should have been done. And adding to the previous question, because I said why it's working for NATO, but why Finland in NATO is good for Ukraine. First of all, it's the indicator that our wish to become the NATO member and the threats from NATO against Russia are the reasons of this war. Because if accession or approximation of NATO to the borders of Russia would be totally sacred, there will be the war of Russia against Finland. It did not take place and it cannot take place. And as for the plan, I don't think there will be the plan of actions for Finland and Sweden, and I think Ukraine does not need this plan. Why am I saying that? For us as the bureaucrats, it would be nice to have a checklist, for us to know how we commit to some of the obligations. But this is just a tool of, several sides of the same coin. France and Germany can use this plan to slow down our approximation to NATO. So it's not obligatory. We will see how it's done as for Finland and Sweden, for those countries. Why should it be then compulsory for other countries? I'm not speaking about Ukraine only, for all of the countries. On the one hand, it's nice to have a checklist. On the other hand, I wouldn't like other countries to have additional opportunities to slow down our joining NATO, which wouldn't depend on our readiness to the accession to NATO. So those 2 points, the plan and that this war is not about NATO, is important. Any other questions? Oleg Boychuk, since 1995 I'm the founder of Euro-Atlantic Council of Ukraine, and I can hear in the informational and legislative field Euro-Atlantic integration. So I'm asking the diplomats, Charlie and others, when do we have Euro-Atlantic cooperations? We don't know, it's not time, but now de facto we have Euro-Atlantic cooperation, right? You are the experts of military political branch, you're famous today. So today we have the change of the paradigm, especially of the military one, not the tanks and not the aircrafts which are the defining, but the space, the informational war is defining. So 2 questions. As of today, I was dealing with the social adaptation of the military. Ukraine is now filled with some construction sites. Can we begin the issue of cooperation on social adaptation with NATO to create little factories? NATO would agree with that, you know that. And another question. How do you consider this cooperation should take place when we have the civil unions, when we deal with totally different plans for the future, not for today? Thank you. Okay, who will answer? Thank you for the question. I would like to answer part of the question about cooperation, which in fact is taking place here directly within Euro-Atlantic integration. Since the beginning of the independence of Ukraine, we've got lots of basic documents, foundational documents which have been signed. First of all is the Charter. On the 9th of July, it will have the 25th anniversary. We are celebrating this anniversary. So if you take this document, if you read it, it will be for 100% relevant. And if we take meal-to-meal cooperation, first of all, the military and the civil security and defense sector, during the last 30 years, we had really powerful cooperation, which, as well as in the case of Finland, does not need the plan to join the alliance, because in some of the spheres, in particular mill-to-mill, we can see that the experience of the operations under the patronage of NATO and the UN, including Iraq, showed that at the tactical and operational level, in fact, our compatibility cannot lead to any doubts, both here and at the partners. But as for the strategic level, the state level, which would allow us to achieve the level of cooperation, it needs the involvement, the daily involvement in these processes. And this is the tool which we have now. What I really like is the annual national program. That is our program of cooperation with NATO, which had to become a kind of bureaucratic mechanism on the one hand, which would list which are our key indicators, which we are trying to base upon, to rely upon for ourselves and for the alliance member countries to show what we are achieving and when we are achieving that. And secondly, the daily work, direct work on cross-functional issues, including with NATO member countries and the states which are in the EU. From my behalf, I would say that at the level of the ministries and institutions, this work, especially after the beginning of the war in 2014, has really sped up. And if we take all the basic concepts and principles, the changes and amendments which we introduced into the legislation and the latest changes which are developed, the amendments to the law on the national security, which we did not have enough time, just a month before the war, we did not have enough time to introduce those changes. Now it's been developed, so in fact it will define all the foundational principles and positions which will allow us to say, okay, at the legislative level we are fully complying with the principles, and now we have the work on the practical level, for each of us at his or her own level to achieve the level of interactions which would be useful both for us and the partners. So I think that we have had already the basic settings, and now it depends on every single person at the state positions or in the civil population, and when we can achieve this level of interaction useful for everyone. Well, of course, the choice of words, the semantics, really matters. You know why the Euro-Atlantic integration emerged. We didn't need to irritate the neighbors. The situation has changed and we need to change the choice of words. Rather often the Western media are still writing pro-Russian separatists, in spite of knowing who they are subordinate to, the First and the Second Army Corps. So I agree, this choice of words can be changed. Secondly, NATO, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, took the very serious position that they won't provide us the lethal support. They are, in fact, had the package of non-lethal weapons. There are some interesting points there, but they can be seen there as well. So undoubtedly, in the context which they were trying to introduce, this is the time, because it's the pain for everyone, and we see this readiness, there is support, and this support won't be endless. The maximum which we can declare now, that what we can declare, we can get whatever we declare. And I really like what was said by Mr. Austin during the first meeting in Ramstein. He said that Ukrainians believe in the victory, and we believe in it as well. Unfortunately, the Germans don't say that. They want Russia not to win, but they don't say that they want Ukraine to win. But it takes some time. And also, he said an interesting point, and they're constantly saying about that. We need to provide Ukrainians with everything for them to win, as they say, this battle in Donbass or for Donbass, but also for Ukraine to be capable in the future to protect itself, and for Russia not to have a courage to attack again. This is an important point for the future. This is when you speak about the projects in the long-term plans, because of course Russia will never vanish. Well, we can hope for its split, but our expectations and hopes cannot be part of the strategy. Yes, we have such a threat, and I totally agree. We need to change the choice of words, and in fact, it was important for us as well. We have more questions. Yuri Lukyanchuk, Шляхом перемоги. Could you please tell, we're always complaining for the insufficient delivery and supply of the artillery systems, tanks, aircrafts from the West, and they say that they have the deficit in their arsenals of those systems. Whatever they provided at the moment, they had different defense capacity. But we have nice military developments of our own, which have not been implemented during the last 3 years. As our military factories are under constant threat of shellings and by the missiles by Russian aircrafts, could we make a deal at the level of the government with the governments of, for instance, Slovakia, Czechia, Poland, Lithuania, and their military factories to produce our own equipment, military armament and artillery, whatever we need most of all for the counter-offensive? Thank you. Oleksiy? Thank you for the question. Well, in fact, what you're saying is a very important issue, and I would say that this issue is more depends on the investors who would allocate certain resources to organize this production, manufacturing, because this is the issue of the creation of Ukrainian manufacturing on the territory of the partner country, or how we did it before. According to the offset schemes, this was the manufacturing with the localization in Ukraine or together with Turkey, when we had some of the equipment produced in Turkey. So I would say it's about the investment attractiveness of this project. If we involve them at the level of the state, and the state provides some of the guarantees, then the investor, first of all, the Western investor, taking into consideration that we have scarce resources, it would be very optimistic. This should be the approach at the highest level, and any state which has the opportunity to provide such manufacturing process can be involved as well. Moreover, the whole Western Europe has something like that. If this manufacturing, if it does not create strong competition against the national product, and this product will be competitive for the wider market, for the world market, and it would be compatible with NATO, like our Bogdana, why not? Or maybe the missiles Neptune. More or less, whatever we do, whatever we manufacture for the 8th year, we are doing according to the standards, or at least compatible with NATO standards. I think it's realistic, but the issue is in the investors. Any other questions? Can I add? Yes, sure. Just a couple of words. First of all, of course, whatever is killing the enemies is needed now. So we don't have time to sign any contracts. Yes, it's realistic, but still. But still, you said that the infrastructure is ruined and destroyed. So after the end of this war, it will give us one of the reasons to reconsider our complex, our defense industry complex. And also we took the proper decision about the NATO standards. If we speak about the artillery shells, there is no sense to create any manufacturing, even the common one, to create the same Soviet shells. And the third point, this ideology of the transition towards NATO standards should push us to reconsider. Maybe we don't need something of what has been manufactured before from the external markets. Maybe we should focus our resources onto what we really need and where we can be really innovative, because in fact you understand that according to some of the forecasts, till the end of this year, the Ukrainian GDP will be decreased for 45%. Where can we take money to allocate them for the defense complex and to create something new? Of course, we need to focus on something what we do best in the world, or maybe the most optimal. And of course, the cooperation with other countries, first of all, Poland, if we say that we were given several howitzers, maybe we should focus on that and just expand it if this suits us. And I think that Krabs do. Together with the Poland, we should take the Polish approach for the development of our defense complex. And of course, after the war, depending on what's left, unfortunately, we are not that protected from Russian missiles, and we don't know what will be the state of our industry altogether, and the defense industry in particular. Yes, please.
I have two questions. So first is about, we touched on Turkey briefly during the talk, so I wanted to ask, how do you view Turkey's role in, ongoing talks to lift the blockade of the Black Sea, and do you think it's possible for the blockade to be lifted until the war is over? Second question is, so President Volodymyr Zelensky said a few days ago, addressing the G7 leaders, that he wants the war to be over by the end of the winter because it becomes more difficult for Ukrainian troops to defend when the winter comes. So how realistic do you think that is?
Okay. First of all, about the role of Turkey, we appreciate what Turkey is doing for Ukraine, even though it's trying to balance between Russia and Ukraine, between Russia and the West, but mostly it's a positive role. I mean, closing down the straits for the Russian ships and submarines, it was a really moves that we highly appreciate, because Russians have less platforms to shell our cities with their missiles. If you're talking about grain export and deblocade of our ports, I believe that it's not going to happen until war is over. For simple reason, if Russia allows us to export our grain, it means that we would have some more money for our economy and some, let's say, some less pressure on the West. Russia is interested in hunger across the world, because it's going to undermine stability in a lot of political stability in a lot of countries like Algeria or Egypt that are important, for example, for France, Israel, and some other. And it will generate, let's say, thousands or millions of refugees coming to Europe. And you certainly remember 2015, when Russia began to bomb the Syrian cities, and it was a huge flow of refugees to Turkey and to Europe, and it undermined political stability in those countries. So that's why I believe it's in Putin's interest to have millions of people die across the world, with the aim to put more pressure on the West in general, in the United States particularly. And it's a pity that a lot of countries, like in the Middle East and in Africa, they believe it's the Western sanctions that is causing these troubles with food prices and the lack of food in general, not the actions of Russia and blockade of Russia of our ports. If Russia was thinking about, let's say, this thing, how to feed these people, they wouldn't target Ukrainian infrastructure, including silos with grain ready to be exported. So that's why I believe we are not going to have our ports unblocked. Because of security reasons, we are not going to allow Russians to, land in Odessa, in Mykolaiv, and other ports. We don't have enough capabilities to restrain them, even though certainly we sank a lot of their ships, and they decided to move their ships out of our range. But anyway, we don't have, let's say, security guarantees that Russians are not going to invade our south from the sea. Thank you.
Vadym, інше питання.
Якраз з цього питання.
Well, I wanted to answer about the same question. I totally agree with my colleague. Not a chance that, as of today, our ports will be deblocked. Moreover, I would say that it's totally right that until the war is over, then Putin will do everything possible to block the ports. And besides the migration crisis my colleague mentioned, there are also several more points. First, that Russians consciously conquering the markets of grain which Ukraine was dominating, or where Ukraine was present. In this case, besides all of the rest, this is the war for the markets, and also this is the war for the deterioration of the state of our agrarian industrial complex, because we understand that our agrarian industrial complex has now just older reserves. If we don't manage to sell the grains, then we won't have money for this next sowing campaign, or at least there will be less money. There will be less money for the modernization, for the fertilizers, for the whole cycle connected with the production of grains, first of all grains. The situation in Ukraine will be harshly deteriorating, and it will lead to the animal farming deterioration, and we will be just going down and back for several years in the agrarian sector. This is not just the war in the European front line. This is the war for the markets and the war for the deterioration of our level of agrarian industrial complex, which in fact used to be a high level one. And another point, we shouldn't forget about that as well. That is that now the main negotiator in this issue is Mr. Erdogan. And it seems to me that Putin will do everything possible for Erdogan not to become a peacekeeper and not to become stronger as a regional leader politically. I'd like to remind the situation with Azovstal factory, when Erdogan was really one of the main moderators of negotiations on deblocking of our military and servicemen at Azovstal plant. But in the last moment, when the decisions could be taken, there was taken the decision that Erdogan is not taking part in the process, and this was the direct decision of Vladimir Putin. I don't think that this decision will be taken as the decision which could allow for the president of Turkey to be stronger as a regional leader. In the end of our conversation, I would like to hear several points from each of you about the support of Ukraine. We heard those statements at the summit. What can we expect? Yes, in fact, during the summit, we heard lots of statements and declarations from the leaders and NATO member countries and G7 before that about the support, and the support which is now declared in the communiqué according to the results of the summit and in other bilateral meetings with our president. Then I have some hopes that still whoever is promising, they will be able to provide the resources. Because in fact, if we take and calculate how much NATO spends as an alliance for all of their needs, and what's the economic situation in the world and in each particular country, then I hope that Ukraine will stay at least for several years the priority, which will give us an opportunity to get both weapons and the projects for these modern systems which we are getting. And I do hope that further on we won't be just delivering the systems, but the systems of the systems. For instance, like F-15, F-16, which in fact are the most sophisticated equipment and the ammunition, the weapons which we'd like to get. So far we did not hear that, in fact, during the summit in details. All of our expectations are that our partners would be able to provide what's already been promised, and that further on we'll get the support which we are asking for. Thank you. Thank you. First of all, both at the G7 and during the NATO summit, the very important political signal was that Ukraine should be supported as much as it's needed and as long as it's needed. That's very important. I understand that it's democracy, the elections can change the political parties in different countries, but it's so important that they don't have some end time frame. During the press conference, Biden was asked, will you always help Ukraine, or will you just decide that that's it and Ukraine won't be supported anymore? He said, no, Putin shouldn't win, so we'll provide support. That's important. Another important point is that when we're speaking about that we are provided with support and Rammstein process is ongoing, I really like that the US president declared about the buying for the anti-air defense system for Ukraine. That's an important step because, you know, this is the very coherent and maybe sometimes slow process, whether Ukraine should get Stingers because it's very special, but then they give it, then some other howitzers, then radar systems. So slowly they decided not to give us only Soviet or Russian weapons, they give us more powerful ones. So if we have anti-air defense, for instance, a Norwegian system, which is very interesting, the next step should be the aircrafts and the aviation, and of course some of the ideas that Ukrainians need too much time to master that. More than 4 months passed, and I think that our pilots would be capable to master them. But I like the tendency itself. I think that it should be developed. And another point, the comprehensive assistance package which has been adopted By the way, on the 24th of February, it showed that our accession to NATO, as for standards, gave some results. We are not having the Soviet war or post-Soviet war, and we need to move along this way. This is a different approach as for the management of troops. It is so important. And in this non-lethal part of aid under NATO should go on, because undoubtedly it's a strategic point, which does not only makes us closer to the membership of NATO, but makes our efficient resources more possible to fight against Russia and further to deter it in the future. So I think those are the key points besides what we already mentioned today. Thank you. I will tell you something really bad. Every time when I hear the criticism against our partners about the volumes, insufficient time frame of support, I always want to say, I understand it's our pain, but we also need to be reasonable and understand that they are live people. And when the Germans are being criticized rather harshly, and their politicians as well, you know, any help is help. Germany is one of the biggest financial donors, so any help during the war has to be considered as the military help. Another point is that Ukraine, in fact, de jure, not being the NATO member, is getting help today de facto as the NATO member. Because if you read closely provision Article 5, the military aid including. So it's not the fact if the NATO country is attacked that each of other NATO members who have the army will instantly send their servicemen there. So I think that before criticizing our partners, we need to thank them 3 times, because they give us whatever they can. And again, I will mention Germany. Again, I totally agree with our ambassador to Germany. We still to be more moderate, because this exhaustion of the war is unavoidable. There is such an emotional breakthrough of the first days, weeks or months, but for 4 months Ukraine is still on the first pages of the newspapers, in the news. On the one hand, it's bad for us, of course, bad news for us, but still it's on the other hand a phenomenon that for the 4 months the attention of the world community is done for the whole population, thanks to you, thanks to the journalists who are present here. But it cannot be endless. Well, I do hope it won't be endless, I'm in the war, but still, the attention can be decreasing, unfortunately, so we need to get ready to the decrease of this support and to do everything possible for the speed of the decrease not to be too rapid. Okay, just a couple of words, please, because we're out of time. Yes, in fact, I really support that we need first to thank 3 times, but we also have to remember that there is the support and the war till the last Ukrainian. I would like that we should have support, not the war till the last Ukrainians. I will remind you, thank you, that we had Oleksiy, Pavliuchyk, Alexander Khara, Oleksiy Melnik and Vadym Denysenko. Thank you, dear journalists, and I would like to ask you if you